Welcome back to the And I Hate podcast, a forum to discuss and combat student hate. Today we are here with Ed Lee III, the Senior Director of Inclusivity at Emory University. Ed works with students and educators on campus to have revealing conversations about equity, race, and cultural identity, and he ultimately uses his knowledge and experience to make the Emory campus a safer, more inclusive space for students of all backgrounds. He's also the Senior Director of the Barclay Forum for Debate, Deliberation, and Dialogue, a tradition dating back all the way to the 1800s, which has allowed countless students to find their voice and feel empowered to use it. So, hi, Ed. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Obviously, I did not do you justice in that short introduction. So, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, you did. I thought that it was a wonderful introduction that I did a presentation yesterday, and there was someone else who was attempting to introduce me, and I would much prefer the way in which you did it than what I heard yesterday. It's brief, it's concise, it speaks to my particular set of values. I think that probably something that I would add here is that I'm very much invested in the community that I live in. I believe that our politics need to be and should be local. And so I serve on an advisory board for the city commission that's called the Better Together Advisory Board, where what we do is we work directly with the city commissioners in order to make the city more welcoming, more engaging, more supportive of the myriad of ways in which people show up within our community. It also has a task of holding the commission accountable for its particular desires and commitments around the question of diversifying our city and creating equitable laws that are fair and more just in the way in which they show up in the lives of its citizenry.
That makes a lot of sense. So it seems like a lot of your work revolves around this idea of justice and equity and creating diverse spaces for everybody. So why were you drawn to this kind of work?
Yeah, I actually think that it's a natural extension of my attractions to debate. That I'll give you a quick sort of origin story. I debated in Atlanta at Harper High School, and I had a teacher, Miss Betty Maddox, who I owe her a debt of gratitude that I will never be able to repay for introducing me to debate and really in both encouraging and demanding that I participate in it. Then I decided that it was not for me. But what we ended up with a topic that was on homelessness, and we wrote an essay. We were the affirmative team, and in the model of debate that we had at that particular time, you had two people who were negative, two people who were affirmative. I was on the affirmative team, and Miss Maddox didn't know a lot about coaching debate. She knew that her other teachers in the English department at other schools had debate programs and that they were very laudable about how significant that those programs were impacting their students. So she went on this journey of learning debate with us as well. And so I, being on the affirmative team, didn't know I had to go do a bunch of research on having cards. And we wrote our essay that was on giving what were functionally transportation cards to unhoused folk who we identified as homeless back then, and so that they could get fresh foods out of vending machines. We lost all of our debate rounds because we didn't know process, didn't know strategies, didn't know that they could read a state counter plan, none of those things. But I was immediately hooked on the notion of having a forum where we could debate and talk about these really important issues. But more importantly, it was a setting where I could articulate my particular issues and concerns, and that was not a space that was available for me in lots of different places. And so that's long been my attraction to debate, that creating a space for me and others to talk about really important issues and move forward and move on. But ultimately, the value that I see of communication skills and practices like what you are doing, Michi, and what I try to do is to get people to understand that the audience is the center of the world that they are engaging. And if we want to be effective communicators, we really need to understand the ways in which our audience shows up with a set of needs, interests, desires, concerns. And some of those are informed by questions of race, class, gender, sexuality, but others of them are not. But being an effective communicator means having an adequate read of your audience. And so I consider the work that I do around creating inclusive communication and more collaborative organizational structures being an extension of debate's emphasis on audience analysis, understanding who you're communicating with and tailoring your argument to them.
Yeah, I really like how you draw a connection between debate and the work that you do because as debaters, I feel like a lot of high schoolers are told, oh, this activity is great, it has so many of these portable skills, etc. And it's really great to see that actually being put into action and seeing how it influences your career today. So specifically, the work that you do at Emory with inclusivity, why is it important now more than ever?
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges that we have as a society, and that's writ large, and that the social dynamics are informing what's occurring on the campus, is that we increasingly have collections of people who are highly polarized, highly charged, and that what we do is that we find people who think like us, love like us, look like us, and we have those people reinforce our own set of biases that we have about the world. And that we increasingly are not sharing spaces with people who can challenge the way in which we see the world, who can help us see our blind spots that we all have. That one of the things that I try to encourage people to not see bias as a derisive term, because if bias just means that we're partial and that we are all partial, that the only way that I can show up is as a Black man who grew up in the southern part of the United States, raised in a household of 5 women, and being the only male who was there. That's the prism that I operate from. That's the frame in which I see the world. That frame is very different from yours. If I want to be a more learned human being who can impact the world and go forward and advocate for policies that are more just and honorable, that actually impacts your life in productive and positive ways, I need to understand how you see the world. I need to understand your lived experience. And I can only do that by talking to you. I can only do that by listening to you and really appreciating that the lived experiences that you have got you to this point in life. And now we can travel together as we move forward. But that together doesn't mean you dismissing your history or you dismissing mine. It means us figuring out how we wrestle with both the commonalities, the synergies, and the ways in which we part together. And so hence my appreciation of this notion of being better together. And so the work that I do on our campus is really vitally important, I think, because it runs in direct opposition to the polarizations that we have in our society, where we have people who consider themselves Trump voters, and they couldn't dare think about talking to someone who is supporting Biden. And some of my closest and dearest friends couldn't dare think about talking to someone who voted for Donald Trump. Now, I don't know how, as a society, we move forward when 48% of our citizenry supports one side, 48% of our citizenry supports the other side. And if we all decide that we're unable to have conversations with people who disagree with us politically, then it means that we're in a stalemate. And that I could draw out some of the conclusions of where that gets us. And it's an ugly history that we have when democratic societies decide that they can no longer be democratic.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely very difficult to navigate the political polarization, which is frustrating because all of the transformative things that you talk about, simply having conversations and understanding people's viewpoints, like seem very easy in a vacuum. And it's frustrating that we can't actually do it in real life. So, how would you suggest that these kinds of revealing and transformative conversations be had at like university campuses or just generally in spaces across the United States, given the political polarization?
So there's a book that I read a few years ago Monica Guzman, and it's called I Never Thought About It This Way. And she is directly trying to tackle this particular issue. She considers herself a Democrat. Her parents are Republican. All of them are immigrants from Mexico. And so the question that she has is, how can she maintain a relationship with her family, considering that they have such stark and different views around politics? And the book title gives you an indication of what she thinks should be our rhetorical strategy and how we really see ourselves and position ourselves in the world. That when we hear someone who thinks about the world in a way that's radically different from our own, instead of maligning them, can we say, I wonder what it is about your life that got you here? That there's clearly something that's very different about your lived experience that brought you to the point to so radically deviate from the set of choices that I would make. And if we are really open and honest to listening to them, what we would probably find is that here's someone who has gone through a tremendous amount of pain and hurt and has really experienced a sense of injustice in the world, that they are deeply concerned that their families, their children, will not be able to have the same set of opportunities and experiences that they have, which is what I hear when I have the opportunity to talk to people who are from the rural parts of the southern parts of the United States, and that their sense of fear is driving them to support candidates and support people who they think are going to provide them with the economic means that keeps their children from fleeing their communities because there aren't opportunities that are there. And that's not to say that we dismiss or not entertain the ways in which that hurt and pain is translating into a form of violence that is being targeted and misdirected towards members of our communities, many times in a highly gendered and racialized form. Oh no, we should think about that, talk about that, and figure out ways of how it is that we make them aware of the harms that they are doing. But it doesn't mean that we also can't empathize with how it is that they got there. I never thought about it that way is representative of a non-judgmental curiosity about the history and experiences that have produced a set of choices that at times have left people feeling that the only option that they have is to lash out at folks who have been identified as those who are evil, those who are the producers of the harm and hurt that they are experiencing. And whether or not that is misdirected or not, we should be able to empathize with the ways, with what has produced that response.
Mhm. It sounds like we suffer from a bit of a lack of empathy in this country. So, how has this lack of empathy led to more harm, such as hate and political polarization?
Yeah, we operate within binaries within our society, and that's sort of a Western dualistic nation that plagues the West in some fairly unique ways, that everything has to have a polar opposite, and that we treat all other things within that dualism. So we think in black and white, good and bad. We see things as rich and poor. There is no middle, and because there's sort of radical juxtaposition between the ways in which we exist, that when I experience harm in the world, there has to be an opposite impulse that is producing that. And that opposite impulse usually is race in a way that's the opposite to me, is usually gendered in a way that I consider opposite to me. So that's sort of the first challenge that we have, that dualistic frame that we operate within makes it very difficult for us to be empathetic to other people who do not look like us, think like us, and love like us. The other challenge that I think that produces us to not be very empathetic is that we really also are in a space where we don't privilege listening. We don't privilege genuinely being curious and entertaining where other people are. the ways, and in some ways, some people would say that debate is part of the problem in producing this. But I think that we would have to sort of extract out to the larger society and the way in which that operates and how communication patterns operate. In that, when you think about how you're having conversations with other people, a lot of what occurs is really trying to figure out when it is that you can insert your position, your presentation, your interpretation of the world, instead of genuinely listening and understanding who they are and where they are and what's produced the sort of performance that they are giving off, or authentic experience, as some people would say that they are having. I think that part of the challenge that we have is that increasingly social media is collapsing the sort of internet or web-based identities are aligning the sort of real world material existence that we have, and that presentational platform where we are always having to present a version of who we are to the world means that we are always curating ourselves and thinking about the best versions of who we are. And that means that we don't give time or space for thinking about or engaging other people. So when we are always presenting, always performing, it really eliminates space that we have for considering the needs of other people. The last thing that I'll speak to about this that I think challenges our ability to be empathetic is that I think about an Austrian philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, who argues that we can only understand our ethical relationships with other people by seeing their eyes. That I only know what you need from me when I see your eyes. Your tongue can lie to me. That in fact, you can hide what your needs are when I ask you, Michi, what do you need? You can try to be guarded from me and say, oh, I'm good. Everything is great. The world couldn't be better. But when I look at your eyes, and truly tell me when you are in pain, when you're experiencing a sense of joy. And that since so much of our time is now spent away from having direct contact, in less proximity with people, unable to linger for a few moments and share space with people, then we have fewer opportunities to see what their eyes are telling us that they need.
That makes a lot of sense. I find it interesting that you bring up debate as like a potential cause of otherization and creating these like different factions, like the in-group and the out-group. I'm right, you're wrong. So what is your position on this? Do you believe that debate increases polarization or that it decreases it?
I think that debate is an amazing pedagogical tool and an amazing decision-making model when we are talking about policy. That when we are comparing what is the proper course of action that we want to take together, when we are talking about what the proper course of responses we want to have together to a social challenge that brings our resources together, pools them as a way of responding to a particular set of needs and figuring out what that right need or response is, I think debate is an amazing tool. I think debate is a terrible tool when we're talking about people's identity. I think that it is an abhorrent tool when we're trying to figure out what our relationship should be with each other. I should not be involved in a debate with you when you are telling me you are in pain, you are grieving, this is how you are experiencing conflict. This is how you are experiencing a set of violence that is existing in the Gaza Strip. When you are experiencing a set of hate, are experiencing the way in which hate is targeting you because of your gender, because of the way in which you are raised. It is not appropriate for me to say, here is a different, better way of interpreting how you have experienced the world. That is, in fact, an act of violence, and we should not engage in it. So I find it quite problematic when we misuse tools of inquiry in ways in which they can do more harm. And I think creating using an antagonistic model, which debate is inherently antagonistic, to say, let's explore our relationship with each other it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I think that we are encouraging us to be really violent to each other and dismissive of the needs that we have, and not training us to be empathetic to the needs and experiences that we have that are very different from our own. And when you overlay that onto some of the other things that we talked about earlier, the way in which there are just ways in which our societal norms already encourage us not to make connections with each other, I don't think that we should be using debate as a tool of exploring identities and experiences and the ways in which we should cultivate relationships with each other.
I agree. Yeah. I think that while debate is excellent educationally, especially for policy making, stuff like that, it's a very unsafe space to talk about identity-based issues. The new meta in a lot of debate forums are like identity-based Ks. And while it's important for students to be able to express themselves, I think that overall it makes the space a little bit more unsafe because it's students comparing experiences that are very like dear to them, probably traumatic, sometimes violent, and they're getting up and presenting this in a format where it operates based off of like negging and saying that certain people are wrong, which I don't think, personally, I don't think that that's a great space to do that. So going back to a lot of the problems that our society has with connecting with others, how you work on a college campus, a lot of these students, especially post-pandemic, heavy social media users, sometimes lack like personal face-to-face connection very often. How have you been able to remedy this and further like the work that you do at Emory?
Yeah, let me preface this by saying you it will be very difficult for you to find a bigger fan of policy debate than me. That I, everything that I have, my ability to have this conversation with you in the way that I'm having it, at the foundation of that is policy debate. There is no joy. I used to tell people the greatest job that I had in the world was being a debate coach. I get to have conversations with some of the smartest students I will ever engage and figure out what it is that the arguments are that we want to make at a debate tournament, go to the library, read a bunch of books, and then help them improve those arguments. And then we go and talk with other really smart students about those. And I get to listen to that brilliance as a judge and come back and rinse and repeat. I have no idea what could be a better job than that. And so I show up here as someone who loves debate, loves the research of debate, loves the combative elements of debate. I think that testing each other's ideas is vitally important. But I also am one who believes that there is no nirvana, that everything has a shadow side and everything can be misused. Water is vital for our lives, but too much water will kill us. And so the way in which I have chosen to try to sort of carve out space for other things where I think that debate can be challenging and pose some difficulties for us is by creating on our campus the Emory Conversation Project. And the Emory Conversation Project is a component of the Barclay Forum that we started about 8 years now. In fact, Lydia Smith, who I work really closely with on creating this project, is receiving a Women's of Excellence Award on our campus this evening, which is why I'm sort of donned and dressed up today, because I get to go bask in the glory of the work that she is doing and really accelerating and moving this work forward. And I get to say I knew her when, that what they are honoring is the tremendous amount of work that she has put in to support the Emory Conversation Project. And we've modeled it in some ways after the debate team, where we have about 25 students who serve as a team together. And what they do is that they learn skills around facilitating difficult conversations. They figure out how to ask pertinent questions. They also figure out how to do collaborative projects. So they partner up with other student organizations. And then we host events on the campus where we invite the entire campus to come and show up. And that there are two guiding principles that we have in what our topics are, our way in which we do this. One is that it needs to be an environment where all ideas are welcome, that we want everyone to show up, that we have a very liberal campus, but we have a not insignificant number of conservative students on our campus. We want to make sure that those conservative students know that this is a space that has been curated for their ideas to be present and tested, but to be present. The other thing that we are also very much interested in is that this is a space where those issues that we tend to only talk about with people who we know will agree with us on, those are the issues that we talk about in this forum. So it is a space where we are talking about really difficult issues and trying to create a space that's welcoming of other people. But it all starts from a place of we are going to respect those who are present. We are going to appreciate that they have experiences that are different from our own, and that we are going to honor those experiences and their histories by listening to them. There are other things that we do in that setting, but at the heart of it is one that is at the forefront of what we do is about identity and relationships and understanding the ways in which people show up in myriad of ways, and how do we honor that? Very different from what we do in policy debate.
I like how you mentioned the involvement of students and how they got trained in certain skills on approaching and listening to these kinds of difficult conversations. So how has the involvement of students in the conversation project enhanced what the conversation project is doing, helped you guys further your goals?
Well, at the heart of what we're trying to do is to teach students to do what we're doing right now, and that you have become masterful at doing at a very young age. How do you have a sophisticated conversation that asks inviting questions of people in a way that welcomes them to explore these ideas together, whatever these ideas are? And so there are times in which the students get it wrong, that there are times in which we lose debates because we make terrible arguments. And but ultimately what we see this as is a training ground for us to figure out what our collective genius looks like. And as Franz Johansson would argue, the only way for us to really figure out what our collective genius is to figure out where our intellectual domains are in opposition to each other and creating sparks when we have an interest in figuring out how to wrestle with them together. That if you have two people in the same room together and they share the exact same ideas, you have one person who is totally unnecessary. And what you're going to engage in is groupthink and in confirmation bias. And that if we truly want to figure out how we can be brilliant and create a wellspring of innovation and creativity, we have to create spaces where people who see the world in different ways, who have different ideological understandings, are going to show up and share those, and we figure out how do we nest those together. And that's when we produce the most brilliant forms of innovation that we have seen in the world. The book that I'm referencing is called The Medici Effect, which is what he's referencing in Florence, Italy, where the Medici family brought together artisans, the bankers, the papacy, the architects, and they all found themselves in the same community. And that is what sparked the Renaissance, both in science and art, in the political process. And so what we need to do is figure out how do we create containers that allows for those differences to come together, not to create what we talked about in the 80s and 90s as sort of a melting pot, because I don't want it. That is not what's useful for us, for this to become a sort of beige where we all look alike and think alike and all the same. That has some really disastrous consequences to it. But what we are very much interested in is how it is that we can appreciate the ways in which our differences can be highly complementary of each other.
That makes a lot of sense. I've also not I've kind of resented like the connotation of the word of the phrase melting pot, because I think that the most important part about Americans isn't like the common American identity. It's rather the differences that each individual person has in their identity. And I've always thought that the melting pot, like melting away those differences, becoming homogenous, is something that is kind of works like counter towards the goals in America and our democracy in general. So students, especially at Emory, have this community. Like they have access to people of different backgrounds, of different viewpoints. So how can students right now reach out, find that community, and be able to learn things from their peers and from their classmates?
Well, I think that we've done, I think, a pretty good job on the campus of creating space for that. Clearly not enough students have access to what we do, that we're limited in space, resources from a staffing perspective. But I think one of the ways in which I want to think about your question is, what can students who don't have access to these kinds of formal structures that I have identified do? And I think that one of the things that we could do is to commit ourselves to being in more proximate relationships with people who do not look like us, to commit ourselves to being in more proximate relationships with people who see the world in radically different ways than we do. We all know that kid who's at our school who is just dressing away that's a little different from all the rest of us. We all know that kid who's walking around our school who, when a conversation is happening, is the one that says something that's different from everybody else. And the way in which the group at times bonds together is by maligning that one person. If we want to be better as a society, if you want to be better as a human being who is on the side of justice and righting the trajectory that we have towards polarizing differences that creates various forms of violence, then I think the choice that you have to make is to opt out of maligning those students and instead run towards engaging them, figuring out how do you have a conversation. One of the ways in which I describe my work on our campus is being a cultural translator. I know that this is not work that everybody can do or everybody wants to do. Some of us have found our truth. Some of us have found our calling to be an advocate of one particular issue and engage in defending that issue at all costs. And I'm not saying that that is an improper choice. I am saying that there needs to be far more people who are willing to opt on the side of being a cultural translator who engages in what is functionally diplomacy, of going from one community to the other, doing the best of job that you can of trying to convey the message in the most earnest way of the experiences that is happening in one camp to the other camp, and going back and forth, engaging in shuttle diplomacy, all the while pulling those communities closer to each other where they can start having more proximate relationships with each other. We need more people, I think, who are committed to being cultural translators in their communities, engaging in that kind of shuttle diplomacy, who will not participate in the bonding of people who are like us through a process of maligning those who are different from us. And so I think a commitment to that work is something that we can do at an individual level and think about how do we build organizational structures that accelerates that kind of work.
Mm-hmm. I love that phrase, cultural translator, and I think that it's a very good way of summing up all of the work that you do and the work that students should aspire to do, rather than, you know, only engaging within a group that they're familiar with, engaging with people that are different from them, have different backgrounds from them, speak a different language than them, have different cultures than them. And I think that being cultural translators is something that all students and educators should aspire to do. So thank you so much for being here with us today, especially a little early. I really enjoyed this conversation. I thought it was very revealing, and your expertise on this issue was really, really appreciated. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. It is clearly much earlier for you than me. I happen to be on the East Coast So I get to deal with that. But your willingness as someone who lived in Berkeley, California for a few years and had family still on the East Coast, I know that the difficulties of wrestling with that time change, particularly early in the morning, and it demonstrates your commitment to this work. And this has been one of the more enjoyable conversations that I've had in years. And I'm quite thankful for your willingness to have it with me. I'm very appreciative of the work that you're doing here. And oh my, is this just a wonderful platform for exploring such significant issues that's plaguing us. But also, more importantly, I think that you figured out a strategy to help us figure out what the solutions are to that. So thank you, thank you, thank you for the amazing work that you're doing.
Thank you so much.